Before we make a video talking about thoth in great detail, let us first talk about the type of bird that he is. Well, obviously, he is an ibis. Which kind of ibis? We'll get into that in another video when we talk about thoth. Well, what I really want to talk about is birds in general in the African context. Now, I could play a video, but I don't want to get copyrighted. But everything about Africa and birds has to do with education. For example, the African gray, which is depicted in so many places around Africa, and of course is found native to Africa, is considered a royal symbol in West Africa, and in some other places it's considered a communication between spirit lands and this world. Now remember, parrots can, mimic human voices, they can mimic sounds that they hear and stuff like that. And so this would have been frightening, except after a while they would have gotten used to it, but it would have been frightening for the average human who was probably communicating to a hunter or someone in the woods, and then they would hear the hunter's voice or they'd hear somebody's voice scream back at them, and when they get back there, all they see is a bird. This bird was used as pets in Africa. In fact, probably the earliest depictions of it comes from ancient Egypt. Now, not all birds can talk, but they can make sounds that to humans look like they're talking. And so a lot of Africans assumed that they were talking, just not in a language that they could understand. These sounds led to a lot of mythologies about songs, and of course, you hear African kids mimicking the sounds. Symbols don't always come in the form of letters or words or songs or anything like that. I mean, I could give you 100 examples of children's songs in Africa, which, if you listen, they're not actually songs. Well, they are, they're bird songs. But some people who categorize music say bird songs don't follow the typical rhythm of music, so they're not necessarily songs. But if we take bird songs, we know that children in Africa mimic these songs, and a lot of them are passed down from parent to child, and they have a deep symbolism. Something else that's passed on is the word for bird. It isn't a secret that you can separate the African languages into four categories. Let's do it together: Afroasiatic, Nilotic, Niger languages, Niger Congo languages, and the so called pygmy languages, Khoisan and the others. Now, what we're going to talk about is the Niger Congo languages. Why? Well, we're talking about birds. Is it possible that the word for bird has been preserved within the African languages? So, this is a shortcut in talking about, if you discover how they treat one bird in one culture, that it really hasn't changed for thousands of years. Is it possible that the word for bird is the same in some West African languages as it is in some East African languages separated by over 4,000 years? Let's start as far east as we can with Kikuyu. Kikuyu is a language that is located in Kenya, and it has tens of millions of people who speak the language. Now, the word for bird in Gikuyu is nyoni. I instantly recognize this word because it's the same in my languages, in the Nguni languages. Now, we know both of these languages are Bantu languages, so this is not really a big surprise, except if you look at all the other animals, you will realize that they almost overlap in nothing. The one of the words she had on the screen, the girl had on the screen, was nyama, which is nyama, which means animal, and it also means meat at the same time, which tells you what they were thinking about animals at the time. But that's an overlap between those two words. But Inyon is one of those that overlaps as well over the years. And I can assure you that it's not every single Bantu language that has this word, but it's still preserved in a lot of them. And not only is it preserved in the way that it's said, but it's also preserved in the mythology. As a lot of birds, like the owl, can represent death, or they can represent life, or they can represent talking to the other world. Now, to compare a country that is nowhere near this East African country, we use the Igbo language, in which the word bird is nyunu, nyunu, and this word here is clearly similar to nyon, and that's just an obvious thing. Now, what you're seeing here is an owl mask. I told you that these animals, they communicate with the other world, but remember, there are good communicators and there are bad communicators. And owls, at least in the Bantu side, tend to be how witches and wizards and all type of evil sorcerers communicate with evil spirits. And so owls, for obvious reasons around the world, are associated with demonic events, probably because they come out at night and they're very mysterious. So why does it matter that the bird has a similar name in probably over 100 African languages if you start from the east to the west in the areas that, for specificity or for specification, the area that they call sub-Saharan Africa? Why is it that that's important? Well, if you're going to relate it to Thoth, which I think is fair considering the fact that we already have so many other animals in Africa that are Africa only, then we should consider the origin of these animals being similar mythologies that have just transformed based on location. And remember, the timeline is not different. So if it started from an initial cause, you're talking maybe hundreds of years of separation, because we're talking about them using it pre-dynastically, and then they separate from the rest of Africa in their own direction over the thousands of years, already drawing from an initial. And the word is where you will get the origin of the words. For example, the word Ghazi meaning palm oil. If we use the Wiktionary, which is a very important website for languages, and I've literally gone and picked up dictionaries and checked one by one, and the Wiktionary, according to what I've seen, is like 99% accurate source wise. I'm not saying it's accurate about what they mean, but in terms of them quoting the original source, it's 99% accurate. So I will use it. And remember, don't trust Wiktionary, trust YouTubers. Yeah. Anyway, if we look up the word bird, we can see here we have Northern Bantu languages, we have Kukuyu, Nyoni. So let's read a few of these. So we can see here in Douala, it's Enon. In Luganda, it's Enyoni. In Toro, it's Ekinyoni. In Nyankole, it's Ekinyoni. In Rwanda, it's Inyoni. In Kabwa, it's Ekinyoni. In Kikuyu, Nyoni. In Northern Eastern Coast Bantu, Mwani, Nyoni. In Swahili, Nyoni. Southern Bantu languages, these are the ones I'm more familiar with. Inyoni, 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 Inyoni. From Zulu, Xhosa, Swazi, Ndebele, all of them. They have this exact word. Now, I will not shock you by saying that the ancient Egyptian language does not have any word even close to this. Now, maybe in some other things, for example, feather, the word feather I've shown you is very similar to some African words and blah, blah, blah. But we don't expect every single word to be exactly the same. Otherwise, we would have cracked the code of what the languages sounded like. They just sound like each other, right? Like if you're listening to Kikuyu, you're listening to ancient Egyptian, but this is not the case. There are only a few traces, and this makes sense. If ancient Egyptian is only slightly related to Bantu languages, then yeah, you would expect a very small number of words to be similar. If we return to Thoth, we know that he's an ibis, which there's many names for different types of ibises in Africa, depending on what you're talking about. But I want you to look at this coincidence between the ibis and the baboon. So we know that in in ancient Egypt, Thoth was typically drawn up as a ibis, but he is also drawn up as a baboon sometimes. And if we look here in the Zulu dictionary, we can see the word ikonde or inkonde, which is a large baboon. And then we can also see here inkonde, which is a large brown bird with a red beak, or the bald ibis. Now, again, we could dismiss this as a coincidence, but why would we do that when we know that there is simple connections in these regions? Now, the name might be not similar, but like I'm showing you with all these other African things, some things just get retained within the language, and it's not a coincidence that it's related to numbers and stuff like that. This baboon is not a new type of deity. It's not a different type of deity, but it is Thoth as the moon god. And you can actually see in the writing, you can actually see the bird or the ibis right at the bottom, written the name of Thoth. And so Thoth can be represented as both an ibis and a baboon. Again, a striking coincidence. Now, Thoth had a duality about him. He is neither good nor evil. And remember, the baboon in Africa is typically a wise creature, but used by evil people to spread evil through messages, music, however. In fact, in South Africa, it's used by wizards in order to spread evil and can taint good animals like snakes and, well, some snakes can be pure evil, but in some cases they are your ancestors. Let's read this passage from this 1800 quote that was got received from African mythologists who wrote about what the baboon meant to them. This perhaps is the best rendering we can give to the words inyanga yemlozi. The Imlozi are supposed to be amatonga or spirits of the dead who wait on a particular diviner and speak in a low whistling tone so as to be heard by those who come to inquire. They are called Imlozi for this mode of speaking. Umlozi is the whistling sound made by the mouth, short of a full whistle. The natives do not call them by any term equivalent to, but they say they are amatongo, a hamba no mundo, or spirits who live with a man. The wild cat and baboon are said to be amangusa, or attendants. They are supposed to have power to bewitch various animals, as dogs, cattle, or snakes, and to send them on a message of malice to injure those they hate. These are of the same character as the sending which we read in the Icelandic legends. They also use imikovu, that is, little people whom they have raised from the dead, by incantation or magic, and who may also be called familiars. Now, obviously, the last one is necromancy, if you use that word. But you can see here there's a lot of equivalence from whistling, you know. I mean, you know what animal does that. But all of these things are sort of drawing you closer to a type, and the reason why I'm doing this is because when I cover the ibis in the sense of thoth, I'm not going to do any equivalency or comparison with Africa in general. I'm just going to cover it based on Egypt in a more in-depth way, because I've done the mythology of ancient Egypt, but I didn't cover it in a true sense. I just showed you one by one, but I want to cover it in a long way. But I don't want to spend most of the time comparing it to Africa or words or this is how you write it or anything like that. But I want to show you that its spirit, its home is in Africa, like any other mythology. And of course, in the final hour or the final seconds of this video, the last comparison is that Africa is an animist, almost fully animist continent, while other continents were also animist. They quickly lost it if you go and check all kinds of places, whereas Africa remained this way forever.